Hi, everyone, and again, thanks for joining this morning. My name is Matthew Dagan. I am the Deputy Principal at Riverside School here in Prague in the Czech Republic. I also act as the Assessment Coordinator for the primary, and I'm part of a data team now which spans through our junior and senior high schools. Today, I plan to speak and share about the ways that we have tried to make our data accessible for all of the stakeholders. But I hope to provide some insight as to how you might best embed your data practices at each of your respective schools. So to begin, I'll start with a brief profile of the school where I currently work. We have an early years, a primary school, a junior high, and a senior high. We're independent, nonprofit, and inclusive. We follow the English and Welsh national curriculum, and we do the IB at the senior high. We have approximately 600 students. About 260 of which are in the primary. In a given year, we have around 50 nationalities, and we've been holding pretty steady at 45% native English speakers. I feel like some of this background information is useful so that you can know what type of student body we're working with as we proceed. So the path that I think really started for our student data was with challenges, and I assume many schools will face these challenges. First, is data essential in your school development plans? Is it driving, at least partially, what you're targeting for the future? Teacher use and misuse of data. The research and literature strongly states that how classroom teachers are using summative data is not very good, whether they don't understand what they're using, if they're disengaged using it. We have a lot of issues with teachers accessing and using data. The third part would be managing the data mountain that many of us may be coming to build or have already. And finally, removing the what now barrier, as I like to call it, which is once you have all of this information, what do you do with it? And each of these challenges for us was a formidable task to overcome and implement individually. But to try to solve them all at the same time seemed almost impossible for us. So instead, we simplified all of these challenges that we had before us really into one simple question, which is how can we make our data meaningful? And by product of that, it becomes accessible. And across the blue bar there, you see, for us to make data meaningful, we decided it must impact teaching and learning. The mantra, so to speak, sounds really nice, but we still had to figure out what do we need to do in order to accomplish that statement. And we came up with the 3 points below. The first being that we really need our data to inform our school leaders. We'll talk in a bit about our SMT and what that means, but how is the assessment coordinator using it, the curriculum coordinators, the pedagogy coordinators, student welfare coordinators, student support, and so on. Are we using data to determine the content of our annual assessment analysis and development plans? And are teachers using data regularly, either actively or passively? And for us, this is where we started on our journey. A major step in fulfilling these points was the restructuring of our leadership team in the primary school. This really helped us overcome points 1 and 2 from the previous slide. Are our school leaders data informed? And does the assessment analysis help drive the school development plan? And as you can see from this layout that I'm showing you now, and I'm not going to read through it all, but the assessment coordinator who's lined up in the middle and who is driving this assessment analysis at the conclusion of every year is then spreading that information and that data on to the rest of the senior leadership team within the primary. We've done away with lower school and upper school heads, and we now have these positions that span years 1 through 6. And what that means for us is that the ownership taken by each one of these members goes through the school from top to bottom, and that each member of the leadership team has an equal stake, an equal share in the data that we're using. And that was very, very important for us. It really removed barriers to progress. It created a stakeholder mentality concerning the student data that we have. And with this model, we could still maintain a student-driven mission in all of our decision-making. I think most important, though, that's because our data is not performance-driven or rank and order-driven. We only want to use our data to affect the teaching and the learning of our students. And you can see through this model, that's the goal on the bottom that we're trying to achieve. But that really took us on to that third point, which is teacher use of data. Like I said, we were really driven by the research and the literature that was out there, and also by what we were seeing at our own school. And if we wanted teachers to really use the data, we had to remove the data oracle, so to speak, within our school, which, funny enough, was me. And the unnatural feeling of somewhat making myself redundant became quite essential if we really want teachers to use our data. So we want our teachers to feel confident to understand various assessments and their purposes. We want them to understand the results. We want the teachers to be able to synthesize data to form narratives about the students, really asking the question why. We want to react to data with planning and strategies. We want the teachers to do this. We don't want me to be the single person at the school who is leading this charge. And in order for that to happen, we felt that data access needed to be somewhat visual in its delivery to our teaching staff. We wanted it to be digital and sortable. We wanted it to be cross-referenced, meaning that it triangulates multiple assessments that we use. And we wanted it to be supportive in synthesizing these student narratives that we were expecting from our teachers. Now, all of this looks brilliant on a slide. It sounds great on paper. And when we talked about it as a management team, it was wonderful. But there is a reality to all of this, which is that data mountain that we all may be facing at the moment. So for us, it's 4 campus sites. It's, like I said, 600 students. Roughly 30 data points are generated per student in a given year. That leaves us with a grand total of 18,000 generated data points. It's a lot of data. And so how are we going to overcome managing this data? And how are we going to get this out to the teachers in the way that we just discussed? The problem with the data on this scale is really that what now barrier that I spoke about in the introduction. What do we do with all of this information? Or if you're a teacher, what are you going to do with 30 random data points for a single student? So I do a simple comparison with our staff that we present at the beginning of each school year. And I apologize in advance for its simplicity. I am a primary teacher. But we put this image up of 30 dots, 30 points that randomly looking at them, there's no sense to be made of them. And I think the reality is most of our teachers are dealing with data in the same exact way. 30 numbers from 4 different assessments really means nothing to them when it's just numbers. But what if we took 30 points and made it 100, and we made it somewhat sortable, and then we gave some story, some beginning and end to those numbers? And what if we even filled in some of the blank spots with visual aids? Well, we get a turtle. The point is, simply put, if you make your data sortable, if you can fill in some of those blanks, your teachers can start to create their own picture with the data. And that's really what we're trying to achieve in its most simple form. Connecting these dots is very important for us. We really want to connect the dots of our data between school sites. We want to connect the dots between our managers and teachers, between our department heads. We want to connect the dots between our teachers and our students, between our schools and our parents. And finally, we really want to connect those dots between individual student data points. So it became clear connecting the dots was our next step as a school. And so Riverside decided to connect those dots that we just went over by creating a web application that was both mobile and desktop friendly. And we call this application our Student Assessment Portraits. We intentionally went with portraits, not the word profiles, as portraits intend to display likeness and personality, mood of a person. whereas a profile in its digital sense refers to the explicit digital representation of one's identity, black and white. We don't think data is about good or bad, strong or weak. There's so much more depth and nuance to the data that we now have access to. We really want to set the tone with our staff that it's a portrait, it's a story, it's a narrative. So this application that we have is comprised of 4 assessments that we use currently through GL. That would include the Progress Series assessment in English and Maths, the past student surveys, and the CAT4 baseline assessments. I do want to clarify that Riverside made the decision to go the bespoke routes, in a sense, in developing our application in-house, but there are many options and avenues that schools can choose to travel. The point is, you do not have to make your own app to achieve student narratives, which we're going to demonstrate shortly. I do hope that taking you through our assessment application will demonstrate the positive effect that data can have on a staff and the students that you may be working with. And if you have similar types of data collected at your school, you can still analyze and synthesize this data for similar effect. When we started making the app, it was obviously, where do we start? Well, we have to start with what should we be learning by assessing our students? And this is what Riverside felt was most important. And again, this is another visual that I show our staff. It's a very reinterpreted visual of the bar graph, where traditional data really ranks and orders student by achievement. You don't gain much from that. And if we take the bar graph and we really start adding to it, what can we really derive? What kind of a story can we make? And I use this as an example. The gentleman out in front in this particular image, why is he out in front? It's quite simple. Well, he's pushing a sphere and everybody else is pushing a cube. Maybe he looks a bit bigger than everybody. He has that natural advantage. Did he have a head start? We don't know. If we look back at the gentleman pushing the cubes, well, why is the guy on the bottom in the back? He looks like he's the biggest. Is he using the wrong technique? Is his cube heavier than everybody else's? The point is, you can start creating a narrative. And you can only do that if you're assessing students for the purposes of progress, finding barriers to student success, identifying learning styles, really looking at baseline strengths and weaknesses, seeing if you have curriculum gaps through your student data, and most importantly, are you willing to make pedagogy adjustments to your teacher practice based on what you're seeing? We have 3 main components to our assessment portraits application, and we rank them in order of importance as the application is presented to the teachers from top to bottom. The first section we call descriptors, and this is really our triangulated data. This goes to show all the different ways in which we can identify areas of support for our children. It then moves on to our student well-being. Those come from the past results. We have a healthy self-efficacy with our students. And then the last part are the horizons and the flight paths, as we call them. And that's really the achievement and progress of curriculum testing in comparison to the potential of a student. So right now, I'll walk you through what our application looks like. Just give me one moment. So this is the interface that our teachers see, and it's a simple search box. We can browse by all students if we would like to. The students are sorted by year group, as you can see down the right-hand side. The left-hand side, blue for boy, green for girl, so that we know if we're looking at a male or female student. We can filter our searches based on year groups or by EAL or SEN. You can type in first or last name and get the individual students. I'll pull up Larissa Ewing here. It's obviously a fake student, but generated from real student data. And when we pull up a student profile, we start with the student's picture so that people at different school sites or leaders of various places in the school have a visual cue as to who they're looking at, name and their tutor group. And then this first section here are the descriptors. Do they have a verbal deficit? It's a simple yes or no if they do or do not. Do they have a verbal or a spatial bias? If they do, this child has an extreme verbal bias. We get a question mark here where we can click and get some further information as to what that means. Gives a little extra for our staff. What we don't want is staff having to find these numbers on their own and compare them to try to determine if there's a verbal deficit or if there's a verbal or spatial bias to the child's learning. If they're on student support, that's listed in this descriptor as well. But probably the most important part for us is this section on fragile learners, where we're taking a student's perceived learning capability from their past assessments and comparing it to their actual baseline capabilities. It creates this quadrant that we see. Visually speaking, it shows a color for which quadrant the student is in, red being something that's flagged up and that we need to pay further attention to. This particular box is identified as a fragile learner, somebody who's not perceiving themselves to be up to their potential. If I click on that, we can see this chart in a more detailed fashion. The student is the blue dot in the bottom right-hand quadrant, and the rest of that child's or that student's classmates are listed. You can roll over to see all of their names. The powerful aspect to this is that it gives a visual cue, and it shows quite quickly a group of students in this cohort who a teacher may need to pay special extra attention to, or what further supports may we put in place to really bring these students and re-engage them with the learning process. If the teacher spans down a little bit further, you can see that all the past surveys are listed, and it's by year. If a child's pass score is low, it highlights in red so that it draws attention to the eye, and it shows if there's a trend, if the score has been going up or down. If the teachers don't know what the pass indicators are, they can roll over and they can get a title heading for each of those. If something is in red, our teachers can click on it and they get a little blurb up top that allows them to understand what this low score means and a very, very brief and basic description of how they might try to support this child. And then finally at the bottom are the flight paths and the horizons. The horizon lines are represented in green and purple for both literacy and maths. And these come from the CAT 4 assessments. These are their baseline potentials that children relatively should not increase or decrease that much over time. And we can see quite clearly the gray line offers their progress from their curriculum achievement scores. So we can see what is the trending progress of the student and how does it compare to their baseline potentials. If a teacher wants to dig a little bit more, there are some question mark links where we get to see some very direct comparison of the students' content category areas for that subject versus the UK national averages. Our teachers have found this to be very helpful in target setting, particularly at the beginning of the year when they are dealing with a new cohort. So if I can jump back to the presentation quickly, what we really want to achieve through the use of the app is creating student narratives. And this is the most important part for us. Can the teachers really understand and look at self-efficacy? Do they really think about verbal deficits? Do they understand what a fragile learner is and can they speak to it? Do they know what the value-added indicators are? Meaning, are our students making more than expected progress? Are they working above their potentials? And do they really use the progress flight paths and horizons to do target setting for curriculum purposes? Can we tell a story for each child, and are we asking why? And so we've started an instructional coaching cycle for our teachers. And I'm going to take you through a demo of what that looks like, or what creating a narrative may look like. And then I'll show you a bit of an exercise that we use with our teaching staff to further embed that in their practice. If we start with the same student that I'm looking at here, Larissa Ewing, There's no verbal deficit. She's not on student support. She has an extreme verbal bias, but yet she's fragile, meaning that she doesn't perceive her learning capabilities to the same degree at which she's capable of learning based on her CAT4 data. And if we look at that pass measure down below, we see a lot of red flags. If we look at passes 2, 3, and 7, they traditionally refer to self-efficacy, where we're looking at students' self-regard, their self-perception, and their confidence. This student is quite low. And if we go down further and we look at their progress as it pertains to their curriculum achievement, in literacy, it's a bit inconsistent, and it really dipped at one point below the student's working capability. And if we look at maths, we have 3 years in a row where the achievement continues to progress downwards, and now it's dipping beneath that child's capability. What we're really dealing with here, though, is probably a student that doesn't need more support when it comes to literacy or maths. This student really probably needs some invisible supports. We need to set up sessions with a counselor. Do we need to identify staff members that can come alongside this student? Do we need to go further and bring in a therapist and go down the route of cognitive behavioral therapy, which we have found at our school to be quite impactful for these fragile learners? If we have the time, I'll take you through one more and I'll show you how, if we look at these two students, we can get quite a different narrative just based on the data. If I pull up Simone, a narrative that I might come to would be different than Larissa. Very good, thank you. Now, right away, we see that this student is not a fragile learner. This student's perceived learning capability is low, and their baseline potential is below average as well, which puts them in that lower third quadrant. Now, many of these students, we obviously care about them just as much as we would the fragile learners, but over 99% of the students currently that fall into this quadrant at Riverside Primary have already been identified as either on the SEN register or the EAL register. So these students aren't slipping between the cracks, so to speak. But it does mean that there's an SEN issue with this child. Now, if we go down and we look at the past results from the year previous, we do see that self-efficacy is an issue with this child. The perceived learning capability and the confidence in learning is quite low, but that doesn't match what we're seeing with achievement at school. As a matter of fact, this child who's on the SEN register is progressing quite healthily from a literacy and math standpoint, and they're performing at and above their potential. And so where our teaching staff or where our school leaders might see a student that's successful, and this is a major success for us, an SEN student who's performing well at school, we really have to consider, is this child still in a healthy position? Why is their perceived learning capability so low when they've had so much success in the school? So we might start asking ourselves, are they the duck that's really kicking under the water just to keep their head above? Is the student really struggling and feeling the impact of the curriculum versus their special educational needs? And are they a student that in a year's time might run at risk to really falling off the edge of the cliff as the curriculum and the pace of schooling increase? So that's really what we expect, or those are the conversations that we want our staff to be able to dictate confidently. So to do so, we've begun our instructional coaching cycle. This started for us in term 1 at the beginning of the year, where the assessment coordinator met with each year group to go through a series of exercises and feedback sessions. And we've used this document that I have in front of us, and I'm happy to share, to begin our coaching sessions. We asked the teachers to use the app to answer concrete and nuanced questions. These force teachers to infer, ask questions, and begin feeling comfortable speaking to the data points and their specific importance. The instructional coach can model the narrative process and answer questions that any of the staff might have during these sessions, but most importantly, it really does force the teachers to start asking why. What does the data mean? In term 2, we plan to revisit the app with our staff as we have updates to our Cat 4 data and our past surveys. But we'll change our focus onto strategies that teachers may want to start introducing in response to the data that they're seeing. And then finally, in term 3, at the end of the year, we plan to have another coaching cycle where our staff, by year group level, will reflect on their interactions with the data and what they may change or adapt going forward. So as you can see, we've made a really big effort to display how all the stakeholders of the school can benefit from our school data. And we believe that going forward, allowing these stakeholders to develop their own practice around the accessibility of the data will be key. From a school leadership standpoint, we can really look at school trends, gaps, cohorts, our student welfare. Our teachers can have quite a strong grasp on progress, attainment, content categories, self-efficacy. We hope to continue developing our parent involvement so that they are aware of student progress, their children's potential, attainments, and self-efficacy. And for our students, we want them to understand what kind of progress they're making, what strengths do they have, and what targets do they need to be setting for themselves. So for us, the journey is not quite over. We have a lot of initial reactions and the next steps. The app is updated and live. GDPR was a major factor that we had to think about in terms of making sure everything was safe and secure with our student data. We did complete the initial instructional coaching cycle with our staff with great positive feedback. We plan to identify and train potential coaches now within the school who can then carry on these same exercises without the use of the assessment coordinator. We're going to do a big follow-up on teacher surveys, which we started at the beginning of the year, so we can really track the effectiveness and the impact that it's having on our staff use. We plan to continue to develop stakeholders through a parent inset series where we start showing them that the app exists and how we're using it. And sitting down with our data team, a next big step for us is investigating ways to integrate our senior high assessment data. Can we find relevance and attachment of common entrance exams, IGCSE scores, and IB scores going forward? Through the realignment of our SMT structure, driven in part by the data analysis and a stakeholder mentality, the development of the student portrait application, data accessibility, and synthesis, we do think that we've increased accessibility and potential impact moving forward at Riverside. We're excited about our future and how it will continue to impact our school. And we're really, really interested in seeing how the mentality of affecting teaching and learning continues to play out amongst our staff. So that concludes our webinar this morning. Thank you all very, very, very much for your time. And I'll defer to Andy now in case anyone may have questions.